Hello everybody, so this is the next video in my literature revision series, and today we're going to be talking about context in Macbeth by William Shakespeare. So as I said in the previous video on A Christmas Carol, context is really important. It's actually worth up to 6 marks out of 30, so it's equivalent to 20% of your overall essay mark. But the only way that you're going to get up the mark scheme is by making specific links between context and the task or the text. So it's no point kind of bolting on context at the end of a paragraph or just in an intro or in a conclusion. You actually need to weave it throughout the whole essay and make a link between the text and the context, whatever it is. And as we go through the video today, I'll give you some examples of what that could look like in an essay. So some key facts about Macbeth. It's a play. It was first performed in 1606. The monarch on the throne at the time was King James I, and the name of this era was the Jacobean era, and please note the spelling on that as well. So why did Shakespeare write this play? Well, it was actually to please the king. He was part of a group of actors at the time called the King's Men, and their patron, the person that actually paid for their plays, was King James. And so obviously you need to please the person that's paying to put your plays on stage. The recent gunpowder plot had shown the country how easy it would be to kill a king, and so it was important to show the strict punishments that any such assassin would face. In this play we see Macbeth, a usurper, meet a tragic end as payment for his crimes. It was really important in this play that Shakespeare showed that Macbeth had to be punished. And that's also a convention of a tragedy as well. The tragic hero or the anti-hero has to pay the price for whatever he does wrong or she does wrong. And at the end of the play, they have to meet their demise, they have to die. If you're not sure of the words assassin or usurper, you can see the definitions on the screen on the right-hand side. Assassin, note please the double S. It's someone that kills someone else, but not just anybody. It has to be someone that's famous or in a position of power. A usurper is someone who takes the throne for themselves, despite not being next in line. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute as well. Macbeth broke a very specific rule when he killed Duncan. James I also hated witches, and so it was important that Shakespeare showed a strong anti-witch polemic, and again, to please King James. A polemic is a strong message against something. The reason that I'm really going to show you these new pieces of vocabulary as well is don't forget you can get up to 4 marks for good spelling, punctuation, but also vocabulary. So if you throw some of these really good vocabulary words in your essays, you can get up to 4 extra marks there as well. So I'll be looking at 6 key areas in this video. First of all, how it is decided who becomes king next. So I'm going to be talking about the rules of succession. Then we're going to talk about the gunpowder plot and how important that was as an influence on this play. Then a little bit about King James. Then we need to talk about witchcraft and witches. Then about women in Shakespeare's time and patriarchy. And then finally about what medicine and health was like in the Jacobean era. So, succession. Again, note the spelling please of succession, so 2 C's, 2 S's. This is when a king or queen dies, and either they decide who takes the throne next, or society does, or the people who are left in charge have to decide who is going to take the throne next. Now, normally this is very straightforward. In this era, it would just go to the male heir, the eldest male heir of the dead king or queen. Now, this rule is called primogeniture, coming from the Latinate root, which means firstborn. But of course, in the play, this is not what happens. Macbeth breaks this rule. When he kills Duncan, not only does he kill Duncan, but he also then kind of declares himself king, when of course it's Malcolm who is Duncan's eldest son. In fact, in the previous scene to the murder, he's made the Prince of Cumberland, which means that he's the next in line. It's like the Prince of Wales in England. So, of course, it is Malcolm that is supposed to be king. And quite rightfully, when he comes back in Act 5 and the end of Act 4, raising the army against Macbeth, he has a legitimate reason to do that. he has his crown to fight for. And this is all from real history. We have examples of this that have happened across the history books. For example, the War of the Roses, and modern TV shows explore this. Game of Thrones talked about usurping and that kind of thing as well. And so this is a very common thing. And at the time, everyone in society would have been aware of this rule and this idea of a usurper or traitor taking the crown unlawfully. When Queen Elizabeth the First died in 1603, it of course should have been an eldest son that took the throne, but she didn't have any children. She never married. So instead they had to look along her family tree, and they found a cousin called James, and he became king. But he wasn't born to the throne, just like Macbeth. So again, this could be an influence for Shakespeare in terms of how he's seen something from real life and put it into his play. So the Gunpowder Plot was a very important event that happened in 1605. Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators, such as Robert Catesby, tried to kill King James. What they did was they put lots of dynamite and gunpowder underneath the Houses of Parliament, and they were just about to light it and explode the Houses of Parliament, and they were caught just in time. But it really showed people that kings were vulnerable and they could be killed. And of course, King James I was terrified, and it was a bit of a wake-up call for him as well. And we very much see this in Macbeth. I think we've got to look at the dates here. This is 1605. Macbeth was first performed in 1606. So it realistically could have been this event that sparked the whole play. And you never know, it could have been King James saying to one of his actors, Shakespeare, and his writer, please could you write a play about what's just happened to me? Because I need to teach people a lesson. I need to teach people that if they kill a king, they will meet a very gory and vicious demise themselves, and they will face a punishment and retribution. The next thing that you need to understand about King James is that he hated witches, and he was one of the kings that actually carried out witch trials. Witchcraft is the term for someone that uses magical powers or the supernatural to control people, events, and happenings. And in Shakespeare's time, they genuinely believed that witches could control the weather, predict the future, and of course this one's very crucial because we see this in the play, were able to change their physical form, so for example turn themselves into a cat or a toad, and importantly had contact with the devil. And there are lots of quotes in this play that link to Satan and the devil and devil worship and that kind of thing. People didn't have very good scientific knowledge, and they certainly didn't have modern technology that we do today. Therefore, when something went wrong, so for example, something like an earthquake or an eclipse, they tried to explain it in other ways, and one of the ways they often did that was to just say it was witchcraft. And of course, you've also got to remember that Christianity was very popular at the time. Most of Britain were Christian, and people thought that witches worked with the devil. In fact, just to make another link there, the people that carried out the Gunpowder Plot, or nearly carried out the Gunpowder Plot, were Catholics. And there was a very widespread kind of anti-Catholic rhetoric at the time, in that King James I himself was Protestant, and anyone who wasn't Protestant, he was not very happy with. And so anything that was kind of anti-God or sacrilegious angered him, and he took very, very strict punishments against people who were not following the faith that he wanted them to. So society hated witches, but they did also fear them. And again, we've got to bear in mind, this was written to please King James I, and so of course Shakespeare is going to portray the witches negatively, because that's what James wanted to see, but also that's what society wanted to see. We're talking of a time when these witches were put on so-called trials, but of course we've got to remember that this image on the slide here, this would be an example of a trial. They would tie a woman that they thought was a witch to a chair, dunk her in a river, and if she floated, then she was called a witch. But of course, if she didn't float, then she drowned and died anyway. So either way, she's going to end up dead. As soon as you were accused of being a witch, then I'm afraid your number is up, and there's very limited chances of survival. So let's talk a bit now about women and the role of women and gender stereotypes at the time. So again, 1606, the Jacobean era, this is a time when women weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to have any kind of professional job, so even acting. So actually in the original stage production of this, all of the female parts were played by men. So Lady Macbeth would have been played by a man, which I think changes things slightly. Inherit directly from their parents, so they weren't allowed to kind of control their own money. So of course, the only way that a woman realistically could have any money to live on or to try and improve their social status was to marry. And we've got to think about the characters of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth and her position in society would have been incredibly tenuous before her marriage. It was probably an arranged marriage to Macbeth, and it could explain why she's so desperate for power, perhaps, because she didn't grow up with any. And the megalomania and the obsession with power that she has could be a byproduct of not having any growing up in this patriarchal society. So, of course, a patriarchal society is what it's called when men rule, from the Latin pater, meaning father. Lots of examples in modern day. This is a question that I'd like you to explore on the final slide. But I think we need to consider the question, who does have power in this play? I don't think it's just the men. And in fact, if I was writing an essay and writing a thesis statement in my introduction, I would probably argue that it's the women. To a certain extent, certainly in the beginning of the play. Lady Macbeth, as you will know from your own reading of the text, she is the dominant partner in that relationship. She is the one that calls the shots. Quite literally, she plans a murder. She's the one that manipulates him very cleverly, diminishes his masculinity, and emasculates him. And also the witches. The witches are the ones who seem to want to take revenge on men in general by, again, playing with them, manipulating them, lying to them. And so we have these 4 very strong female characters who actually succeed in manipulating someone as powerful as Macbeth. You've got to think back to Act 1, Scene 2, when we're given the description of Macbeth, and how he brutally takes retribution on the traitor and seams him from the nave to the chops. And he's called "O valiant cousin, O noble gentleman," and of course he's about to get the promotion to Thane of Cawdor. So he's a very worthy general, another quote, and he's a very well respected person in the army. And yet he is manipulated by these women. And at the time, I should think male people in the audience wouldn't have had much respect for Macbeth right from the beginning when that happens, because they would think that Macbeth is being controlled by women and that he's not kind of being masculine enough and all those kind of things. The final thing I want to talk about is medicine and health. Just really important to note that people in this day and age did not receive the correct medical treatment, and the doctors at the time were not equipped with the proper skills or knowledge. Again, this is a time when leeching was a very popular remedy, so they covered your body in leeches that sucked out your blood. This is also a time when they did things like drill a hole in your head because they thought that let the bad spirits out. I mean, that is what we're talking about here. So if we do have characters who are suffering from undiagnosed conditions, they wouldn't have received any kind of help. And a common reading of this text is that Macbeth is probably suffering from something like PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. He's been a soldier for a number of years. He's carried out lots of killings himself. He's also probably witnessed some really brutal things. And we have things such as Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene, where he's hallucinating, but also when he hallucinates the blood on his hands, and Lady Macbeth as well. Her mental state, her mental health deteriorates so quickly and so dramatically. We see her in Act 3, and the next time we see her in Act 5, Scene 1, she is sleepwalking and sleep talking. and she seems to have deteriorated very quickly. And again, I can't help but think that if they had received some sort of counselling like we have in modern day, or medicine, then they would have been able to cope with these mental health conditions a lot better. Another thing to consider is we are told that they have had a child that has died. Lady Macbeth says, that she's breastfed, and that she knows what it is to be a mother. And if that's true, then that means that they've lost a child. And of course, that kind of impact on a person is devastating. And again, that kind of loss could cause PTSD. So I think we have to look at the Macbeths, plural, so Lady and Macbeth, from the point of view that they are suffering. They seem to be suffering mentally. Even before the play starts, they seem to have some kind of suffering or loss that they've had in their lives. And then, of course, as the play gets on, it gets just worse and worse. And Lady Macbeth reaches her kind of tipping point after the deaths of Lady Macduff and the Macduff children. And again, is that because it triggered her because she remembered the loss of her own child, or is it because she realised that Macbeth is completely brutal now and has no remorse and will kill innocent women and children? And she might realise the monster that she's created, and the guilt is what kind of tips her over there. So lots to consider. Put a couple of questions on this slide for you. So if you want to pause the video now and have a go at these, you could submit them to your teacher. Just a couple of things off the back of the PowerPoint today. And then on the last slide here, just a few links to further study. So Spark Notes, a really good link to a BBC Bite-Size page here, and a Mr. Bruff video as well. So I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for watching, and good luck in your assessments.